So let's take a look at how biofuels are made. Biofuels are a renewable energy source, unlike fossil fuels, okay? So we're working to replace gasoline, and we can do that with biofuels. So one of our biofuels that we use a lot is ethanol. Ethanol can be a biofuel. You'll often see this in our gasoline supply, actually. When you go to fuel up your car, it'll say that your gasoline is supplemented with ethanol. One of the reasons for this is because this is a renewable energy source. And so in order to create ethanol, here's how we normally do it in the United States. So we use starch molecules. These starch molecules normally come from corn. That's where we're getting them from. So we get this molecule called amylopectin and amylose, and that's extracted from the corn, that comes out of the corn. So here are the molecules themselves. They're really big. I'm not going to require that you know what they are other than you know their name. And there's a lot of carbons in them. So these are all carbons here, even though they aren't drawn out. These are all carbons, 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 okay? And what happens here is we have these enzymes that go in and they break these molecules down into glucose. So this glucose now is available for energy conversion because bacteria eat this stuff. Eat glucose. And when they're done eating the glucose, what they excrete is ethanol, which is great for us. So essentially we have this, we put in our corn, we feed the corn to these enzymes. The enzymes break them down, and then it's available as feedstock for the bacteria. And the bacteria munch those and eat those, and now we've got ethanol produced. So this is all going on a scale that we can't see because there are bacteria, tiny, tiny organisms eating them. But this is how we make biofuel from corn. Now, if you remember, we had talked about that ethanol, let me draw the molecule out for you. See, this is our ethanol molecule. Okay. This is different from gasoline. Gasoline is normally octane, or it has a high octane percentage, which has 8 carbons in it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and these all have hydrogens on them, okay? Based on our rules about which one contains more carbon-hydrogen bonds, we can clearly see that the gasoline has more energy in it. Ethanol has 2 carbons, it's a lot smaller, it's oxygenated, it's just not as efficient. But we still put it in our gasoline, and there's a good reason for that. And despite that, our engines in our cars are actually not designed to burn pure ethanol, so we have to put a mixture in. So ethanol was added to our fuel supply in the 1980s because of concerns about U.S. dependency on crude oil overseas and also environmental pollution. So there are a couple of upsides to using ethanol, even though it's a very inefficient fuel. You can see this here, actually, when we look at our BTUs. This is the energy needed to raise the temperature of 1 pound of water by 1 degree Fahrenheit. It's an energy unit. We can see that over time, from 1993 to 2013, that the energy content of gasoline fell by about 3%. That's because ethanol was included. Ethanol's been added. So the energy we get from our fuel now is less, which means that you have to fuel up more often because there's less energy in your gasoline supply. And we can see that by the oxygenate content going up in response, okay? So that also tells us ethanol was added. And as we know, when we add oxygen to our fuel, it is less efficient. It has less energy in it. So drivers need to refuel more often because of this change in the chemicals inside of the fuel source that we're using. So another reason to include ethanol, besides this dependency thing on foreign fuels, is that ethanol changes vehicle emissions. So remember, when you burn fuels, they turn into this. But there are also some other compounds that get emitted. So carbon dioxide, this is a greenhouse gas, right? And we're trying to reduce our greenhouse gases because that heats up the planet, and there are a lot of other types of downstream effects that are not good. So ethanol decreases emissions of carbon dioxide. There's less carbon dioxide being produced as this molecule is burnt. It also can decrease other types of toxic chemicals that come off of the combustion of gasoline, because gasoline is a mixture, it's not pure. So sometimes you can get things like benzene in there coming off, but it's a complex mixture. It's not a pure chemical, so it's a little hard for me to describe what's going on. But there are other chemicals coming off besides your CO2. Ethanol, on the other hand, has other chemicals coming off of it too, and it can produce this thing called acetaldehyde. That's this chemical structure here, which is another thing that we don't really want to be producing. So just know that your gasoline produces harmful things, so does your ethanol. I'm trying to kind of show you the pros and cons here of what's going on with this fuel source. So just a heads up, you are not going to be required to know this on the exam. I am going to ask that you understand this, that using ethanol does decrease emissions of CO2, and that ethanol using different chemicals can change vehicle emissions. I'm not going to ask you to know specifically what chemicals it's changing, like the benzene and the acetaldehyde. So here are some pros and cons of using ethanol in our fuel source. So we can kind of see this fuller picture here. So the reason it was added to our fuel supply in the first place is because it reduces our reliance on foreign fuels. It also reduces emissions of certain compounds like CO2. And it's a renewable energy source because we get it from corn. Now, some of the cons of using ethanol is that we have to fuel up more often because it has less energy in the molecule in general and compared to gasoline. It also has a different emission profile, so it has other types of compounds that come off of it. It's just not CO2, or it's just not as much CO2, sorry. Another thing to know about ethanol is it uses a lot of corn. So right now it actually requires 30% or more of our nation's supply of corn. So most of the corn produced in the United States is not going to food. It is going to fuel supply, and sometimes it also goes to feedstock for livestock, for animals and stuff. And it is more expensive to produce right now than gasoline, to produce our ethanol. And not to mention, this fuel source is reliant on water and fertilizer supply. So there's a lot of pros and cons to using this, and it's a big debate on is it more renewable or not to use this ethanol. Okay, we're gonna move on. Okay, let's talk about something really cool that we're actually starting to develop more of, and that is cellulosic biofuel. You might have heard this term before, cellulosic biofuel, i.e. biofuel made from cellulose. This is a molecule. Previously, we had said that the biofuel that's being made that's being turned into ethanol is coming from starch, which comes from corn. So this one comes from cellulose. Now, cellulose doesn't come from corn. It comes from all plants, all plant material. So this means any plant material can be turned into energy. We don't have to use corn. So this is how our cellulosic biofuel is made. We have our plant cell walls, and inside our plant cell walls are cellulose. That's what they're made up of. They're made of glucose molecules. And remember, I had said that bacteria eat glucose and turn it into ethanol, which is perfect for us. Now, some of the problems with this is that the cellulose in the cell walls is mixed with other types of molecules. So it's mixed with other molecules that we don't want. Are not needed. So most of the problem here is extracting the cellulose, separating it from the stuff we don't want, and isolating it so that it can be broken down by our cellulase enzymes, turned into glucose, and eaten by the bacteria so we can get our fuel source. So that's where all of the headache comes in. Okay, so here's the headache. This is where the issue is. So we have to have some kind of pre-treatment to break it down and some kind of separation process. So let's talk about that. Okay. Another thing to know is what's cool about cellulose is because there's just more glucose in it than starch. So if we get this process down, it actually means we can produce 250% more ethanol per acre than corn. So not only is it using something that we need for other things, like we need corn for our livestock, we need corn to feed people, we can use waste products for this. Any plant can be turned into cellulosic biofuel. So that means that we can use any plant and it makes more energy if we can harness it. So let's take a look at this pre-treatment, okay? What is this pre-treatment? So we've got to get cellulose to glucose in order for it to be eaten by bacteria. So this goes to bacteria, and then they turn it into ethanol. That's where we're going with this. So in order to get this complex cellulose molecule, it's connected to a lot of different glucose molecules, and we need to break it apart. We do this by a process called hydrolysis. This is our hydrolysis process. And what's happening here is acid is added to break down these molecules. And this acid is a catalyst. What a catalyst does is it speeds up a chemical reaction. So it makes this breakdown happen a lot faster. Remember that our fossil fuels, so our cellulose, if we take these plant materials and we compact them in the ground and we bury them under the earth and we let fungi and bacteria do their job, over thousands and thousands of years, they turn into hydrocarbons, they turn into glucose, they break down, right? So we can do it that way, or we can use a catalyst to speed up the reaction, because we need it now, not 1,000 years from now. So we use acid catalysts to do this. And so what actually happens here is your acids like HCl, oftentimes that's used, come in here and they stick hydrogens on here. And there's a chemical reaction that happens, and it breaks these molecules apart. It breaks them. And splits them into individual glucose molecules. So this catalyst, this acid catalyst, goes through this process called hydrolysis, which breaks down your cellulose into glucose, and it does it quickly so that the glucose can go to the bacteria, and the bacteria can eat it and turn it into ethanol as a fuel source for us to use. Now, this cellulose stuff actually is starting to become more prevalent. And like I said, some of the pros of this is that there's more fuel per acre of plant matter that you use, and you can use stuff other than corn, which is great. Now, some of the cons are honestly that the technology is just not there yet. Right now it's kind of costly because the technology is not there. But as of like 2021, we're seeing a lot more research into this area, and it's really interesting. I think we're on the cusp of switching over to cellulosic ethanol. It's a change that's happening right now. So if you all are following the news on this, you might actually see a lot of interesting news articles coming out about cellulosic biofuels and transitioning from corn feedstock to other types of plant materials. I've seen reports of them using actually like leftover corn husks. So they're using corn husks instead of the corn itself to create ethanol. There's all kinds of cool different sources where you can get this stuff from. If you want to see a more comprehensive review article on this, I have put one on Canvas for you to read. It's under this module, so if you want to have some light reading and review how biofuel is made and some of the pros and cons and how it's being implemented in the United States, you can read that article. So some of our first generation biofuels we had talked about are coming from starches like corn. Some of our second generation are coming from our cellulosic biofuels, which is anything. It can be any of these plants. And there are other types of research going on, which we didn't quite talk about. But if you want to follow the news and see how this is going, you can stay abreast of the development of biofuels.